Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. My name is Erin Monsuiter, and I actually work with Jade. So, I decided to come to this event to support her, but I also wanted to meet Adriana, so it's nice to meet you. I also work at thank you. I also work at multicultural services and programs as well. I'm the LGBTQ Resource Center graduate assistant. So, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Sydney, and I also work with Jade, and so I just wanted to come and support her as well as La Casita.
Awesome.
Hello.
And my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm John. I work with Jade also for MSP. I'm the student lead, and my pronouns are he, his, and him.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shay Phillips. My pronouns are Z, Zir, and Zirs. I'm staff on campus. I work at the Mentoring Center, and this is my second year here, so I'm trying to just get a little bit more involved in all of the queer-related things going on campus.
Welcome.
My name is Brenda, and I also work with Jade. And I came because I wanted to learn more about the Latinx like meaning, because I've been like hearing it a lot lately, but I really like don't know that much about it. And my pronouns are she and hers.
Welcome, Brenda.
Hi, my name is Dua. I'm doing my grad study in education leadership. My pronouns she, her, hers. Interesting about the multiculturals and to discover like a new culture.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nyla. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I also work with Jade. So I came to support her and just learn about something new.
Hello. Jade, you have so much support. That's awesome.
Yes, thank you guys for all coming.
Did we get everyone?
No, hi everyone. My name is Sofia, and I work at the Department of Teaching and Learning at ISU, and I'm also doing a master's in student affairs higher ed. I'm Latino, I'm from Uruguay, and I just want to find more. I have to admit I'm pretty ignorant on these terms, and I want to just learn more and how to get involved in the ISU community and just to learn, listen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did we get everyone? All right. So I'm gonna jump into my presentation. My next slide is going to be a little interactive. I'm going to ask folks to use the chat option. I have to figure out how to access the chat option while I'm presenting. So I also want to say, I don't think that I said my pronouns. So my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I want to start by talking about what comes to mind when you hear these specific terms? So let's talk first about the term Hispanic. So in the chat option, if you want to take just a few minutes to tell me what comes to mind when you hear the word Hispanic. Mm-hmm. So I'm saying Spanish language, speak Spanish, someone who speaks Spanish, of Spanish heritage. Great. What comes to mind when you hear the word Latina or Latino? Okay, let me see if. It sounds like I'm having some issues. Can you all hear me okay now?
You're just cutting in and out a little bit. Like I can hear you. It just like is a little spotty.
Okay.
We'll be okay. Like sometimes it goes in and then out, but right now it's doing okay.
Okay. If that changes, please let me know.
Yeah,
So,
it's a lot better, so.
okay, good. Thank you. So when we hear Latino, Latina, we think of Latin America, a female or male person from Latin America, born in Latin America or from Latin American parents. Latina, I think of woman. What about this last term? So this last term is pronounced either Latinao or Latinat. And maybe you've never seen this term, and so if you haven't, feel free to write that in. If you have, tell me what comes to mind when you see or hear that. So Latina and Latinos is not super common. It was for a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm seeing folks that say they've never heard of it. It seems to be more gender inclusive, a combination of Latina and Latino, someone who's non-binary, a gender neutral term. Great, thank you all for your input. So I'm gonna go through some of these terms and talk about where they come from, right? So I think oftentimes we hear that it's just a word. I think we all know that words have a lot of power, right? So the words that we use, the words that we hear growing up, all of that has some power to it, right? It helps conceptualize how we think about things, what we think of as possible and not possible. So I want to share some historical context for some of these words, because I think it's important as we think about the timeline of where we're at now in terms of the term Latinx and where we might be going with some of the language around gender inclusivity in the Latinx community. So in the 1980s was when the US Census started using the term Hispanic to really account for the influx of immigrants from Latin America. So this term comes from prior to the 1800s. when the Spanish Empire colonized part of the Americas, right? And so in that time, Spain was called Hispania. And so that's where the word Hispanic comes from. And it really sort of grouped people into, or under, I guess, the Spanish crown and by language. So a lot of you mentioned in the chat that when you think of the word Hispanic, you think of Spanish speakers. And that's true, right? That's pretty much what Hispanic means. So it ties people together, it groups people together by linguistic heritage. But it doesn't include Latin Americans who don't speak Spanish. So in the early 1800s, when these territories eventually won their independence, right? And right now, Latinx Heritage Month or Hispanic Heritage Month really celebrates those celebrations, those independence. They became really a home of distinct cultures, right? What we call mestizaje, or the mixing of indigenous Americans, African Americans, other ethnicities, and European. So in 1856 is when we first heard the term America Latina. And it was used by a Chilean writer and a Colombian writer. And for them, it was a way to be able to conceptualize people outside of imperialism, right? So it talks about folks who come from Latin American countries outside of just the colonization piece. So they're no longer tied to the Spanish language or the Spanish crown, but really this idea that Latin America is a group of countries and that they don't all speak Spanish. So am I not sharing my screen?
I see it.
I can see it. It just changed to in 2000.
Yes, okay.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. So in 2000 is when we start to see the word Latino. And that really appeared, so it started in the census, and it has become sort of common practice now, right? We hear Latino a lot, and it's used as an umbrella term for people in communities south of the US border, or anyone from Latin America. Now, when we see Latino, because Spanish, like a lot of the Romantic languages, it's a gendered language, right? So the O in Spanish often, or almost always, means male. So in Spanish, like a lot of the Romance languages, the default is male. So we see the word Latino to mean folks who might be women, men, and non-binary. It's supposed to be the inclusive term in Spanish, which is problematic, right? So if I am hanging out with a group of my female friends, I would say that I am with my amigas, right? I would use the A to signify that I am with women friends. If a man were to join a group of 10 women, then it would change it to amigos, which means technically male, to account for that one male person, but then sort of disregards the group makeup as default. Does that make sense? So it's problematic, right? And that gender neutral in Spanish really means male, especially when we start to think about power, when we start to think about inclusivity, and when we start to think about the LGBTQ community and folks who do not identify in the binary. It also sort of, right, it's tied to patriarchy, which we know is problematic. So there have been some attempts to be more inclusive. Oftentimes we see this Latino/Latina to help sort of include both. But people argue that that can sound redundant. I think most problematic though is that it relies on a binary, right? So there is still a form of exclusion in that it is only accounting for two genders and not folks who fall outside of those two genders. And then we see this term that not a lot of people see. I think this was mostly, I want to say probably in the like 1990s that we started to see this now, maybe 2000, which is pronounced again either Latinat or Latinao. Again, it's the O and the A, so it still relies on this gender binary and is exclusionary of trans and non-binary folks. And there's this other argument that the A is inside of the O, and so there's still a male dominance in the way that this is. The other problem is that as we become a more tech-savvy sort of virtual online world, using the @ symbol often doesn't translate, right? On computers, it means something different. So it's problematic in that sense also. So this is where we begin to see the word Latinx. So the term is a way of stripping away the sexism and patriarchy while also including all Latinx folks, right? So it is outside of the gender binary. It was added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary in 2018 and is defined as a gender-neutral term for Latin Americans, but has been especially embraced by members of the Latin LGBTQ community as a word to identify themselves as people of Latin descent possessing a gender identity outside of the male-female binary. So when we think of the word Latinx, really it's embedded in this part of queer Latinx folks, right? So really this idea of making space for people who fall outside of the gender binary as a part of folks who have Latin American descent. Now there are some arguments against the word Latinx, quite a few, and some of you may have seen some of these articles, but I'm going to talk about two main arguments against Latinx. So the first one is that it challenges the purity of the Spanish language, right? So a lot of times we see arguments that Latinx is not a Spanish word, and that it just doesn't fall within like correct grammar, that if you're saying Latinx, you're not speaking Spanish. So the argument against that is that Spanish, like any language, has evolved and will continue to evolve, right? Based on our needs, exposure, migration, etc. When we see a lot of the Spanish words that we use dependent on country of origin, there's very clear evolution in terms of some of the other cultures that were embedded. So for example, when we think about some Mexican words, there's a lot of indigenous words that have become embedded as a part of normal Spanish words. So things like chocolate, right? Chocolate has an indigenous root to it. And you can see the same across other Latin American countries, right? So the Spanish that we speak now is not the Spanish that was brought over from Spain. It's not, right, like the pure Castilian Spanish. And it probably will look very different in 20, 30 years. And the same can be said for any language, right? So like Old English language was gendered at some point, right? Like in the 5th century, and has evolved to what we now speak, which is pretty gender neutral for the most part. So when folks are talking about the purity of Spanish, it's important to note that language, any language, to stay alive really has to evolve. The second argument is that it is a colonization of Spanish or an imposition to the Spanish language. And some of the responses to that is that Spanish itself was not a native tongue to folks who are now living in what is now Latin America. It was a language of colonizers and it was used to colonize, right? So the Spanish language was imposed on indigenous folks and folks of African descent in what is now Latin America, and their native tongues were to some extent diminished, erased, prohibited, etc. Another interesting argument against this, against the idea that it's colonization or imposition, is that the X actually has its root in some indigenous languages of Latin America. So Spanish, Castilian Spanish, didn't actually really use the X ever. So we saw the X during the colonization of Mexico, which is where we see, right, Mexico currently has an X in it, whereas during the times of colonization, it was written with a J. So just some very interesting, I think, arguments for the use of Latinx when we're talking about colonization of a language that really was brought over by colonizers. I do want to just take a moment to note that sometimes what we see is like, I don't identify as Latinx being an argument, right? Like, I don't identify as Latinx, I don't see myself as Latinx, I don't want to use it. And the concept that making space for folks, that being really inclusive doesn't take away from the space of anyone else, right? So I don't have to identify as Latinx, but that doesn't mean that I should not include space for folks to be able to identify as Latinx. And that's really important. So on my current campus, this is our 3rd year using Latinx Heritage Month as opposed to Hispanic Heritage Month. And a part of that move was really to be as inclusive as possible for all of our students on campus, right? And understanding that folks of Latin American descent are also part of the LGBT community, are also folks who don't identify on a binary, who are still strongly tied to their heritage and culture and who still want to be a part of Latinx Heritage Month. And it's important for us to include them in ways that are very public and very welcoming. I included some there's just 3 very short little narratives about why folks choose to use Latinx to identify themselves. And I picked these 3 because I think that they include very different pieces of it, but are really important to share. So the first one, means being gender neutral in a culture that is so obsessed with gendering everything. It means to love and embrace your heritage while still being able to love and embrace yourself. Not everyone fits in the traditional male or female categories, so why try to force people in a box? I identify as Latinx because I honestly don't feel like a girl, but I'm also not masculine. I'm somewhere in between, and I'm extremely comfortable with that. The next one says, to me, identifying as Latinx is embracing the intersection between cultural identity and gender. It's about inclusiveness, making sure everyone is accounted for. Spanish in particular is a heavily gendered language. Everything is male or female, so we're non-binary trans people. We love our culture and want to be included too. I identify as Latinx to assure everyone's voice. Okay. I'm sorry, I see that I'm breaking. As the biracial son of Mexican immigrants, I have at various stages of my life described myself as Latino, Mexican American, Hispanic, and Chicano. None of these words ever felt right. None of them painted the whole picture of how I see myself or how I want to be seen. I felt I had inherited an identity with too many facets: language, race, geography. Which one should win out? I felt I had inherited an identity. But Casita tells us it is precisely this struggle, the search for a cohesive identity, that defines us as a people. It's not a halfway state of being, but a complete state of being unto itself. I can think of no better extension of the sentiment than Latinx, that's willing to become whatever it needs to be for the person who wears it. So Latinx is not perfect by any means, right? It's really hard to substitute all A's and O's with an X. So saying Lex amigas is confusing, right? And it's hard, and I get that. And I think a lot of people understand that. So while it's not perfect, it is a start to begin to really the Spanish language and work to be more inclusive. And I think that's the important piece, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but I think that it's critical that we try, that we're doing some work to be able to push up against gender norms and patriarchy, like patriarchy. My final slide is about a new term that's really emerging a lot in Argentina and in some other places. I think it's slowly making its way to the United States. For Spanish, it's still challenged with binary male dominance. So it's this E at the end, Latine. And so this word is really challenging both things, and it's pushing out an E for them. So instead of los amigos, we would say las amigas. And it's a little bit easier to pronounce than the X. But for now, I think LatinX has really grown in popularity, and I think it makes sense. I think that the E is a really good substitute. And I have a feeling that we're going to start seeing it a lot more. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
I have a question because I know a lot of individuals don't like the word Latinx because they like to identify as Latina, Latino. So like instead of like, why did your school decide to change it to Latinx instead of Hispanic? Like, did they just do that because of the binary, like for LGBTQ kind of?
Yep. So I think that there was a double reason. So one, Hispanic can be, it seems a little dated. I think there's a growing, like our younger student population does not identify as Hispanic as much as maybe some of the older generations. And Hispanic does, again, sort of rely on language, right? So only folks who speak Spanish. So it excludes folks from Latin America who don't speak Spanish. So that was part of it, the move away from Hispanic. And then the moving towards Latinx was really around how are we most inclusive. And so there was a lot of conversations about what Latinx means. And we really took the first year, so it was the first year that I was there, so it was 3 years ago now. We used a lot of our Latinx Heritage Month to do education pieces. So we had a lot of workshops around what Latinx means, how to use it, when to use it, to help build understanding. And really the takeaway with that is that we have to be able to respect the way folks want to identify, right? Like we have to respect folks where they're at, who they are. And that doesn't mean that it changes how we identify, right? So like making space for everyone is critical. And so a part of that was really what was pushing us towards, if we want to build an inclusive campus, then we have to do it in all ways possible, including the language that we're using.
I have a question, Adriana. Have you done any research or other countries that have gender-specific language? For example, German. How do they approach this?
I haven't. That's a really interesting question because again, a lot of the languages are very gendered. I haven't done any research around any of the other uses. I actually just started reading about some of the youth movements in Argentina. Again, it's still Spanish-based, but moving towards Latine is really it's really interesting.
Yes, in Uruguay, for example, the government kind of was trying to pass the gender inclusive language, lenguaje inclusivo. So there was a lot of backlash with the E, changing the A or O to the E. There was a lot of backlash. It was very hard. It didn't even get to parliament. It's been discussed there. And then we have the Real Academia Española, which would be the one that overlooks the use of Spanish, has rejected that inclusive language several times. So that's another interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, so I've been reading about that. And I think for me, I think what we will see is that the change will come from the bottom, right? The change will come from the people that will eventually force the language to change, which I think is what we see in lots of different cultures. So I think that's the really interesting piece of this, is that as we change as a society, we're gonna stretch our language to meet us where we're at.
Yeah, thank you.
And just to add to that answer a little bit, one country example that I know the most about because it received a lot of news coverage in the past like 10-ish years is Sweden. And I don't know how gendered the rest of their, but they have gendered pronouns kind of similar to English that are very distinct. And they created a gender neutral pronoun that replaced I think the two pronouns originally were Han and Han with an O and an A in the middle, and they created a new one that had an E in the middle to be hen. And it was something that people had been pushing for a while, but sometime within the last 10 years, the government made it a universal thing. And there have been some psychological studies coming out of that showing that as that becomes more prevalent, it's changing the way people think about people and images that are assigned that pronoun.
Super interesting stuff. I actually saw just a brief blurb about that, the hen as a pronoun. But we know from a lot of psychological research what gendered language does to young people, right? Just like we know that racial bias is also deeply embedded, right? Language that we use around that. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Shay.
Hi, I'm sorry that I came in late. I had an appointment before this, but one question that I had has to do with how much is this coming from a United States influence? Because I'm remembering a conference for Spanish professors, and people in Latin America were very upset that the Real Academia was pushing Spanish rules of the language on them. And they felt that that was still colonialism happening in the language. And so to what extent might that be the US influencing other countries more than they really care to be influenced?
Hard to say. So I know that the ECIs has been used in different countries. I don't know that it's to the same extent as we're using it in the US. There are, again, other movements that are using the E instead. As one of the arguments against Latinx is that it's really a US academic sort of push. And I'm not sure how or not that is. I do know that there are folks in other countries, in Latin American countries, who are using it. A lot of those folks are academics, but not being being stationed in the U.S., being a part of the U.S. culture. Can't speak to any of that outside of the research that I've done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is the E a newer, that's a newer word, correct? In the past year? Because I've never really, I didn't know from Sophia, I didn't know that was being pushed in other countries.
In Uruguay, we don't use the X at all. We do use the E.
You do use the E, not the X.
And yes.
Okay. So is it fairly new where you're from too, the E, or has it been around for a while?
It's as Adriana said, it's being pushed by younger generations wanting to be represented, and yes. So, and unfortunately, as many issues, is also being very politicized. So depending on where part of the spectrum you are, you might have an inclination to use it more or to be against it more. So unfortunately, that's the case too.
So do you think Latina pronouns like ella will surpass the use of X in upcoming years?
I honestly think so. I think that the fact that they're being used more organically in places like Uruguay and Argentina, and that they are easier to use grammatically. I think it will. I will say that I think Latinx is probably here to stay for a while, even if we begin to use the E, just because it's become a part of like the U.S. sort of Latinx culture. But words like ella, and using the E instead, I think are just so much easier to say and understand for folks outside of just writing them. So I definitely think that the E will take off.
To what extent are you seeing them occur in social media?
I haven't seen the E very much in my sort of like US based social media. Like Sophia was saying, they're pretty prominent in some of the other countries. I am starting to see a few more academic folks using them in emails too, like in emails and things like that.
Anyone else have any last questions that you would like to ask Adriana? We're all good. Okay. All right, Adriana, thank you so much for coming to talk with us today.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate all the questions and your interest. This was really great. I was actually very nervous, but I had a really great time. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Zoom worked well. Thank you. Always technology difficulties, so glad it worked.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And then Jade has my email if you all think of any questions or for whatever reason, feel free to email me.
Are you making your PowerPoint available to us?
Yeah, I can absolutely send that to Jade.
Yeah, if you send it to me, I can send it out to all of you guys that attended to have the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Great, thank you all so much. Have a good day.
Okay, gracias.
Yeah. De nada, gracias.
Ciao.
Nice meeting you.